everyone, I'm back with chapter 2 of Mirage. I'm here at a campground in Indiana, so if it gets loud, it's because there's children playing, their families out having dinner, and that is Friday evening, so anything could happen, but don't be alarmed, it's just the campground noises. So thank you for tuning in again, and again, this starts chapter 2 of Mirage. Upon arrival at Delta Grove, the first thing Sadira noticed was how large the land was and how many buildings there were. She later learned that this had been the first plantation built in the region when Arkansas was still known as the District of Louisiana. It was also the most popular, having over 400 slaves at any given time and even leasing the slaves to other landowners throughout the Pulaski area. Delta Grove operated like its own little city. The main house where the owners lived was a beautiful 3-story Jacobean brick home with 2 additional 2-story wings on each side. One wing housed the library and ballroom, and the other was used as living quarters for the house servants. There were smaller houses near the main house where the bookkeeper and overseers lived. There was a smokehouse, wash house, blacksmith shop, and plantation office. A sugar yard that housed the mills stood in the middle of the land, and there was a trash house as well as a carpenter's shed. Each of the aforementioned buildings was made of brick or stone. Besides all of these, there were vegetable gardens with a variety of crops, stables and barns with livestock, and silos for corn and grains. Finally, there were the slave cabins. Quite telling of the regard held for the inhabitants, they were made only of wattle, mud, and straw. The evening that the newly purchased men and women arrived at Delta Grove, there was an unmistakable awareness of heavy oppression that brooded upon the air. It brought about a haunting and horrible insecurity on the new residents. After exiting the wagons, Sadira and the others were divided and taken to 2 empty cabins. Each was comprised of 1 room, several straw mats, and a table with wood bowls and oyster shells that were used in place of forks and spoons. From the auction, 15 slaves were purchased. 7 would be housed in one cabin, 8 in the other. In Sadira's cabin, there were 2 other girls, both near her age, and 4 men who looked to be between 18 and 20. She recognized 3 of them from Coffee Tree, but did not know them since her family had always been somewhat sheltered from the other slaves. They lived in a brick home right next to her father's residence. It was a near replica of his house and not much smaller. She and her siblings never worked in the fields. Their duties consisted of gathering fruit, eggs, and fresh flowers, milking the cows, and keeping their own home tidy. It was always in pristine condition, and her father never failed to make mention of it during his frequent visits. He was there at least 4 times a week, but was always gone by the time the children awoke. It took many years for Sadira to understand why he never had breakfast with them, why he didn't have clothes there like the rest of them, or why he spent so much time at the other house with that white woman and the children who lived there. They didn't know why she couldn't play with them, or the black children of the plantation, or why her siblings were her only friends. More than anything else, Sadira never understood why the other slaves didn't speak to them. Whenever they were outside of their home, the others would whisper to each other while staring in their direction. They would roll their eyes, and some would even holler other things like house coon and Jezebel spawn. She didn't get it. Wasn't she one of them? She and her brothers were all very light, but her mother looked like the others, and she had taught them all that they were proud Africans just like her. She was left clueless until she came to live on Delta Grove. The first night was difficult. The other 6 seemed to be bonding very well, but they had very few words for Sadira. She cried herself to sleep, wanting desperately to be with her family, wondering where they were and if they were feeling the same. She wondered if they would forget about her and grow close to others, or if they would be treated as well at their new residences. There were so many questions that would not be answered, and even more emotions that would not be nurtured. The next day, she and the others were awakened early and led to the fields. This was foreign to Sadira and the work tedious. She wasn't sure she would make it. She was terrified witnessing the maltreatment of the field workers. She was stricken with dread at the sight of the overseers trotting about on horses, carrying whips and threatening the workers with their dictatorial presence. These feelings were compounded by the misery of solitude. Reminiscent of her life in Kentucky, no one spoke to her. On Coffee Tree, she had her family, but here she had no one. After a few days, Abraham, one of the slaves who had been purchased from Delta Grove, sat next to her as she ate dinner on the cabin floor. With no greeting or like niceties, he began, "You don't seem all that stuck up." "Huh?" Sadira answered. You don't seem toffee-nosed, haughty, highfalutin like everybody always said." "Like everyone always said? I beg your pardon. Highfalutin, haughty? That's 'cause I'm not," Sadira snapped. "And who told you that anyway?" "Not one of you took the time to even get to know me and my family." "I just know what I was told, and I respond to hints," Abraham answered. "It was mean, just mean that you treated us that way. Some of you were downright surly," she replied angrily. "Now hold on, girl. I didn't treat you bad. I didn't treat you no way. You and your mama and brothers went about your business, and I went about mine. We was always told that we was owned by the master, but that y'all belonged to him, and we were best leaving all y'all alone." "What do you mean we belonged to him? He was my daddy. My mama was his woman. Of course we belonged to him." Sadira surprised even herself at the tone she was taking. Her mother had always told her that she had it in her to stand her ground and hold her own, owing to the African blood that flowed through her veins. She would say, "You got my pa'as Wolof and my ya'as Shanti. You are more than enough." "Now just a minute, Miss Hard-Hitting," Abraham chided with laughter. "I don't know nothing about all that, but there sure were enough rumors. It just seemed like y'all didn't want nothing to do with the rest of us. I can see how it may have looked, but believe me, I would have done anything to be around everybody. My daddy wanted us to stay around our house. He wanted us all there when he came over, and he wouldn't let us talk to that woman and those kids in that big house where he lived either." "Girl, you can't possibly be that pretty and that dense all at the same time." "What do you mean? And don't call me dense." "I mean that woman and those kids was his wife and his children, your brothers and sisters." This was all too much for Sadira to comprehend in that moment. How could all this have been kept a secret from her right in her face? She wondered if her brothers knew. She wondered especially if her mother knew. She surmised that she had to have known and just kept it from them. Sadira didn't know whether to be mad because her mother kept the truth from her or to love her even more for the same reason. At this point, however, she was just glad to have someone to talk to. It was very odd, though, to have her life dictated to her by a stranger. Abraham continued for the next few weeks, giving her inside information about her own family, about her own existence. He told her that the house slaves talked constantly about how her father and his wife were always fighting over his second family. They said he had threatened to put his wife off the plantation and move AC and her children into his home if she didn't comply with the arrangement as it was. The biggest blow came when Abraham revealed to Sadira that she and her brothers were never to have been sold, and that her father's wife purposely sold them out of spite. He told her she was meant to be free and that her mother had forfeited her freedom for her children. All that she thought was real in her life was actually a carefully designed illusion. When it all became too burdensome for Sadira, Abraham would hold her until she fell asleep at night. He let her cry on his shoulder, and in essence he provided a place of refuge. She felt safe in his arms. He even took to kissing her sweetly on the cheek, and she started to feel a unique love for him. But like everything else in her life recently, as soon as she became comfortable in her space and in her affinity for Abraham, a change was ordered. After nearly 6 weeks on the plantation, Sadira was called to the great house. There she met Elizabeth Avery for the first time and was told she wouldn't work the fields any longer. She would train under one of the aging servants to eventually take her place as the main cook. That servant, Charity, had raised Harlan and all of his siblings and had served his grandparents as well. She was a quadroon who was passed to Harlan's parents as a wedding gift, and then to Elizabeth and Harlan when they were wed. Charity was now nearing her 80th birthday, or so they had estimated, no one knew for certain. And as was usual practice at Delta Grove, she would be retired to the slave cabins to live out the rest of her days. As a mulatto, Sadira was not as light-complexioned as Charity. Despite this detail, she was still deemed by Harlan a suitable replacement and dweller in the main quarters. As well, living in the same home would provide him easier access to her whenever it pleased him to be in her company. Oblivious to Harlan's intentions, Sadira's first day in the great house gave her a profound and eager hopefulness. The other house servants, 20 in total, which included cooks, dishwashers, maids, seamstresses, and gardeners, were very welcoming. She was amazed by the number of certain and varied jobs they were given. Ennis and Willard were domestics in charge of butchering and prepping the meat needed for each meal. Hannah was 12 years old and was there to help Charity with the minor kitchen work like chopping vegetables and kneading dough. They even had a woman, Cara Lee, whose job it was to set the table and make sure there were fresh flowers and fruit at each meal. Sadira started to wonder if this was what went on in the house where her father's wife and children lived at Coffee Tree. She thought she and her family were the most important to him. Now she knew that there was a whole other world that had existed right next door to her. She, Azy Diallo, and her other brothers were actually outcasts, while she thought they were the apple of her father's eye. Things were different in this house. She was accepted. No one knew about her past, and because the house servants and field hands rarely had occasion to intermingle, the source of her newfound shame was a cosseted secret. She had people to communicate with, and many were able to converse with her while they worked throughout the day. During these times, they shared their experiences on the plantation. Ennis and Willard, in particular, were especially detailed in explaining how to stray from trouble. As a house servant, Sadira would be allowed to sleep in a half hour later than the field hands, albeit the field bell went off at 4:30 a.m., and Elizabeth would include her in the reading lessons she gave to her domestics. Yes, her first day gave her a bit of comfort. Her first night, however, left a prevailing sentiment of edgy discontent. Sadira ended her day smiling inside and out. She wished that she could tell her mother that she was well and that everything was fine at her new home. She stood in the open window of her bedroom, and amidst a constant stream of rhythmic memories, she prayed that the rest of her family had fared as well as she. A soundless breeze that was little more than a whisper seemed to affirm her desire, and she lay on her bed draped in crisp white sheets, excited about what the next day may bring. As soon as she had lain down, fallen into a dreamy stillness, and began considering the events of the day, the man of the house made his first of countless visits to her room. The rosy self-portrait she had painted of anticipated life on Delta Grove had instantly become a wistful stain. Where it was common knowledge that Harlan made his rounds with many of the young slaves around the plantation, it also became obvious that Sadira was his favorite. She was a gorgeous girl, and her innocence made her even more attractive, especially to those with predatory and pedophilic tendencies. Harlan seemed to flaunt her whenever his friends and male family members came around. Whenever he had taken to the bottle too heavily, which was purposely abetted by his companions, he would offer her to them as an act of hospitality. Sadira had hoped he would tire of her over time, but to the contrary, his visits became more frequent. Each one left her more degraded, and depending upon whether or not he had been drinking, more beaten and battered. One day, just before Charity was released, Sadira confided in her about Harlan. She told her how she had been violated and that she was dreadfully afraid of him. With so many years of plantation life under her belt, Sadira was sure that Charity would provide sensible and practical advice. To her surprise and dismay, Charity explained that this too had been her experiences with Harlan's grandfather, Dunmore Avery. Charity had never known life outside of Delta Grove. She was born on the plantation and raised collectively by the slave women who lived and worked there. Her guardians knew that Bethan Avery was her father, but there wasn't much conversation about him. Instead, they focused on telling her all they could about her mother. Just one day after giving birth, she had been forced back to the fields to work. She was a mulatto teenager, just like Sadira. She should have been a house servant, but had fallen out of favor with Harlan's great-grandfather, Bethan, the original proprietor of Delta Grove and the first generation of Averys to live in the United States. One could only speculate as to why she was thrown out, but it wasn't a stretch to presume that she must have thwarted his advances at some point. Like most landowners, he saw no difference between his crops, animals, or the people he purchased. They were all just property in his eyes, and the women had no right to protect themselves from being raped, beaten, or loaned out to other white men for their physical gratification. The black man, regardless of the relationship with these women, had no right to protect them. To most whites, African people weren't human. In fact, it wasn't until 1787, when Charity was 24 years old, that the U.S. would declare that slaves were 3/5 human. As a young lady who was now banished from the main house, Charity's mother was sent to work out in the fields. The overseers were directed by Beetham to be especially hard on her. She was already pregnant with his child when she was sent away, and months later gave birth to Charity. The day after giving birth, she was ordered back to the fields, and she collapsed multiple times while she worked. The other slaves tried their best to cover for her, but each time she fell, the overseer would whip her with the cat-o'-nine-tails and force her to her feet again. Finally, after hours of enduring this abuse, Charity's mother fell once more. The overseer approached her to beat her again, but she didn't move. Her lifeless body lay motionless. Her white linen garments were stained crimson. A continuous stream of blood flowed from her corpse, and it stained the earth beneath her. She was 14 years old. As was usual practice with an orphan slave child, when the mother died, the other women on the plantation united to care for her daughter as if she were their own. Charity's mother was well liked on Delta Grove, and the other women felt they owed it to her to ensure the proper nurturing of her daughter. When Beetham's son, Dunmore Avery, married, Charity was sent to work as his wife's house girl. He made his intentions toward her very clear right from the start. Having been told the story of her mother's death and warned repeatedly by the women who raised her not to fight him when she went to live at the main house, she never resisted. Dunmore was also conscious of the fate of Charity's mother, and he let her know that she would be taken care of if she remained on her best behavior. She invoked both the concepts of mind over matter and survival of the fittest, and for the next 2 generations, Charity successfully served in the Avery family's main house. Through the years, she had become pregnant 4 times. Each child was stillborn, and many suspected that she was somehow causing these deaths. Having been raised by women who had come from different parts of West Africa and even a couple of countries in the East, Charity was educated in a multitude of cross-cultural customs and traditions that she may not have otherwise learned. As Sadira sat with Charity and heard her story, she couldn't contain her tears. Not only did she realize that this was standard behavior for the Avery men, she was struck dumbfounded by the details of the story. An additional stratum of pain was added when she became conscious of the fact that Dunmore Avery, the man who had forced Charity to be his concubine, was actually her own half-brother. If her children had survived, they would have been both cousins and siblings simultaneously. Sadira asked herself dejectedly if there was any end to the madness of the Avery clan and life on Delta Grove. She had no idea that the real madness had not even begun. Thank you so much for tuning in. That was Chapter 2 of Mirage. We'll be back again with Chapter 3 and keep going until we finish the story of Sadira, her clan, and life on Delta Grove.